First question we have, I don't know necessarily if these are for our speaker or not, but what alternatives are there to fracking? Do you have any comments on that?
I'm not sure what the intention of the question was, whether there are alternatives to using fossil fuels, do you think, or fracking itself?
I was fracking itself. Was there another process that we decided to go with?
Well, I mean, there have been gas wells developed without hydraulic fracturing for many years. What we're talking about mainly is high volume hydraulic fracturing in industrialization of the landscape. I think, I'll probably be accused of being naive here, but I think one of the things we really do need to be doing here is thinking in terms of not so much developing more energy sources, but rather conserving the energy that we do use. I could just speak from personal experience a little bit. We actually used quite a lot of natural gas a few years ago, but until we sort of tried to understand what where it came from, and what it was doing to the environment. And we've changed that a lot. In fact, we use almost none at this point. And it wasn't hard to do that. I mean, all of our energy, all of our electricity comes from the sun. All of our heat comes from our land. So I think we can get by with a lot less gas than we're using today, simply by paying attention to how much we use.
Okay, another question, and again, I'm not sure this is directed towards our speakers, but why are the gas companies using average citizens instead of trained engineers? And again, I'm not quite sure what this is referring to specifically. Why are the gas companies using average citizens instead of trained engineers? I'm not sure specific what that means. I don't know if whoever asked this question wants to add a little more detail. My understanding is, yes, the boots on the ground people are average citizens, but there's engineering, there's science done behind the process. So it's not just like a whole bunch of people are let loose and say, hey, we're going to go down and try to get some gas out of it as well. My understanding is it's a scientific process that has been engineered. So I don't know if that answers the question. Next question, how much will Act 13 medical gag rule affect your studies? Citing specifically the lack of full disclosure, imposing confidentiality agreements on medical professionals, no funding for health studies despite Marcellus Shell Advisory Commission recommended one to be done.
Gosh, that's a good question. Because we're not doing a prevalence sort of thing, I don't know how much it will affect it. I do know we always want more information, and when we hit the wall, even with one case, it's not good. We always want more information. And I guess that where it would affect us the most is sharing of information, because I do talk to medical professionals and confirm the health information. And so if I talked with somebody who said, I can't talk to you because I've signed this non-disclosure, then that stops me from finding out more information, or possibly even on other cases. So I could see where, especially if we move to the next phase of epidemiology and we try to include a lot of cases or get a real feel for a big population, that non-disclosure agreement or Article 13 thing could really close us down, could close that phase of research.
I could just say, in terms of health impact studies, health impact assessments, there has not been one done, a complete one done on this process. There was one started in Colorado. It was shut down halfway through. We know some of the results from that, but it was never completed. In New York State, a bill just passed the Assembly to require a health impacts assessment study. It probably will not pass the Senate and will not happen. So I think it's unfortunate. We need it, and we're not going to get it from the legislative climate in any of the states in the Northeast.
This one's sort of a two-part question. In your paper, do you supply information about the farms in which the case studies take place? And I'll give you the second part. Specifically, they're looking to see if any farms have sacrificed their organic status due to exposure.
Do we identify the, well, we don't identify, we don't give out any private information. So we don't connect it with a name and a person. It's pretty much anonymous, but confidential. I don't know if that answers the first part of the question there. The second part of the question, have organic farms lost their status? And that's no. My understanding, the organic certifiers in New York are very concerned about this issue. And they're wanting, at least is it wanting a moratorium or a ban in New York? They finally jumped on board with saying, we have to stop and look at this process before we go on. I don't know about Pennsylvania. I do know several organic farmers in Pennsylvania, and they tell me that they are still able to sell their products as organic. No one's coming in and telling them that they're not, even though all this may be happening right next door to them. So does that answer the question? I hope so.
The final question we have, and again, I don't know if it's specific to you, but do you have any comment on EPA statement that to mix water is safe to drink? I realize that's around water, and that's kind of a loaded question, but have you, I know you've done some research in Susquehanna County, or if there's any.
Well, I wonder.
The question is if they have any comments on EPA statement that to mix water is safe to drink.
I've read the analysis, and I would challenge the EPA official that made that statement to drink the water. It's of 5 of the 6 reports that I read, there was significant contamination. So I don't know what's going on there, except I don't believe we're good.
How can they get away with saying it's safe, but it's not? How can they get away with making that statement? They said there was no fracking fluid found, or no thermogenic methane.
Well, for one thing, there's plenty of thermogenic methane that's been found in water wells in Pennsylvania, and it's been associated. I mean, it's been shown that there's a gradient from some wells of thermogenic methane away from the wells. I mean, I think it's very well established that methane from gas drilling can migrate into the aquifers. I don't think anybody would question that at this point. The question of whether frac fluids themselves migrate is still an open question. I think it takes a lot more to get them into the water, particularly in Pennsylvania, because this shale is fairly deep. In other places like Wyoming and Alberta, it's a bigger issue. In terms of how they can get away with those statements, is in fact that some of the substances that are tested don't have MCLs. If they don't have MCLs, then, well, I guess it's safe.
I actually have one question for you about. One question I wanted to ask you about your case studies. When you did your case studies, are there certain things that you, let's say, learned from those case studies that you didn't know before? And then, are there still things that you need to find out from your case studies? And where do you see your studies going in the next couple of years?
Oh, that's a good question. Thanks for asking that, Eric. So for each study, we do follow up. And so what's been interesting for me over time, especially with the farms, where there's been significant hit with reproduction, is following those farms out the following year after they're supposedly remediated. Some of them are ongoing. Production and processing, more wells are being put in the area or on the property, is to follow those out longitudinally. So that's been great for me. I didn't really look into this whole thing when I first started. I just thought, okay, I'm going to document these cases, but we're getting a lot of that information. The other information that we're getting too is with humans. So we're starting now to see some of wall, just the beginnings of it. Some young women failing, not cycling properly, and also some cancers, cervical cancers in young women that are close to these wells. So what I would like to see again, what we talked about earlier on, was that next phase is epidemiology. Like say, okay, let's look at, and I'm hoping that possibly is it Geisinger study, is that, you say that right? That will bring a lot of this out, this epidemiology, and saying, what are the things that we're seeing that are closer to these intensive drilling areas as opposed to counties that don't have it? Do we have these things that, health impacts that we could really say, these are really strongly associated with that sort of thing? And I'm learning all the time from my cases that every case is different in some ways. The exposures are, even though they're generally the same, they're always a little bit different. There are some wells that are different. Some places have compressor stations right there. So the air part of it sometimes is very strong in cases. We also now have one case in North Dakota that's extraction of oil from tight shale. And that's a big beef farm that we've been following now that's done an amazing amount of testing of air, water, and soil. And so that's been very interesting for me to see too. And I want to pull in more of those cases because it's the same process. It's this high volume hydraulic fracturing. It's just used for oil instead of gas. So that's also been very interesting. So I'm going to keep doing this, and also we're trying to get involved in the next phases of the epidemiology aspect of this research.
I've got one final question, and I'd like to, have a comment beforehand. What I've seen out in the field when we've been out doing our research and talking to people is that some companies do an exceptional job of making sure best management practices are implemented, and other companies do not. They follow regulation as regulations written. Some go above and beyond. In your studies, some of the studies you presented, there were obvious violations. I'm wondering if there was any correlation between violations or the similar agencies and the cases that we've seen, cases that were studied. Is there a correlation? Has there been a correlation between violations?
Happens to me all the time.
Cases that were studied, where you believe there's a correlation.
Okay.
Clearly, a pit liner leaked.
Right.
Power leaked out.
Yeah, I guess we need to see more cases. I think we're going to need to see more cases to answer Eric's question about correlations between numbers of violations and the cases we've seen. Because, to be honest, in some of the cases, there have been a lot of violations. And I guess what's amazing to me is in some of those cases, all of the violations are reported on site. In other cases, they are not reported. I don't know why. In some cases, there are no violations, but the exposure occurred, especially when we're talking about air. Well, we've got a big compressor station next door. That's going to be operating. There's going to be air contamination. They're measuring air contaminants. There are no violations. The compressor station, as far as I know, hasn't broken any law, but there's a real exposure. So the cases differ. So I think if I had maybe 100 cases, so now we have a little over 30, that I might be able to answer that question a little bit better.
One of the important points to note is that there have been many cases where there have been clear violations, but they're not reported. So not all problems, broken liners, stormwater, broken liners is the big one actually that happened. We've seen that in a number of cases where that's clearly happened and it's not been reported anyway.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending.